The gavel came down like a gunshot, and the crowd surged forward to see the chains come off her wrists. "Sold to the highest bidder once the coin is counted," the auctioneer bellowed, his voice cutting through the rain-slick square of millers crossing like a whip. 200 silver for the Steeljaw woman, offered by Baron Aldrich Vance himself. Urzoth Steeljaw did not flinch. She stood on the raised platform in the downpour, torchlight guttering against the wet stone around her. Her wrists still raw from the iron the Slavers' Guild had clamped there 3 days before. Her tusks caught the firelight when she bared her teeth, not in fear, but in warning, the way a cornered wolf shows its fangs before it decides whether to run or to kill. Green skin gleamed with rain. Her dark hair was bound back in a single thick braid, and beneath the torn remains of a captor's gray shift, the muscles of her arms and shoulders spoke of a life spent with a blade, not a loom. Baron Vance stepped forward through the crowd, flanked by 2 guardsmen in oiled leather, a purse of silver coins swinging heavy from his belt. He was a soft man with hard eyes, the kind of man who bought things because he could, not because he wanted them for any good reason. "Bring her down," Vance said. "I have paid for her." "You have paid for a corpse, then," Urzoth said, her voice a low rumble that carried across the square despite the hiss of rain and thunder in the distance. "Because I will be dead before I am anyone's property, little lord," the crowd murmured. Somewhere at the back, near the hitching post where the horses stamped and shied at the smell of orc blood and fear, a man in a mud-stained work coat stood very still, watching her with an expression none of the merchants or guildsmen around him wore. Not disgust, not hunger, something closer to grief and something closer to awe. That man was Luke Reed, and he had exactly 4 silver coins to his name. He had come to Miller's Crossing that evening only because his last mare, a chestnut named Willow, had thrown a shoe 2 miles out, and he needed the smith before the storm broke fully. He had not meant to see any of this. He had not meant to feel his stomach twist at the sight of a woman, orc or otherwise, chained and sold like a plow horse in front of a jeering crowd who called her monster and beast and worse. The auctioneer raised his hammer again. 200 silver going once. Wait. The word left Luke's mouth before his mind had agreed to it. Every head in the square turned. Luke Reed felt his face go hot beneath the rain, felt the weight of dozens of stares, felt the particular shame of being a poor man drawing attention to himself among the wealthy. He was not a large man. Years of breaking horses and mending fences had given him a lean, corded strength, but standing among cattle merchants and the Baron's guard, he looked like exactly what he was, a stablehand with mud on his boots and a coat 2 winters too old. "You have a bid, boy?" the auctioneer asked, not unkindly, but with the particular condescension reserved for men who clearly did not belong in this transaction. Luke swallowed. He had 4 silver coins. He had come to pay the smith for new shoes on Willow, and for a bag of oats besides, and that was the whole of his fortune in the world. 4 silver, he said. Laughter rippled through the crowd, ugly and bright. Baron Vance did not even bother to laugh. He simply turned his back, dismissing the interruption as one might wave off a fly. "The bid stands at 200 silver, the auctioneer said. Going twice, Urzoth Steeljaw's eyes had found Luke in the crowd, and they stayed there. Something in her chest, some cold and wary thing that had not softened in 3 days of chains and mockery, shifted at the sight of a man with nothing offering everything he had. She had watched the crowd all evening with the flat, assessing gaze of a soldier counting enemies. She had seen greed in every face, cruelty in some, indifference in most. She had not expected to see a man look at her the way a person looks at another person. "I will choose," Urzoth said suddenly, and her voice was iron enough that even the auctioneer paused with his hammer half raised. "You do not choose," Vance snapped, rounding back toward the platform. "You are sold, orc. That is the end of it." "Then unsell me," she said, "for I would rather die on this platform than go to your bed, little lord, and you may explain that to whatever masters sent you to buy flesh at a crossroads market." She looked past him to Luke, and something in her tusked mouth that might have been the ghost of a smile flickered and vanished. "I choose the poor one." The square went silent but for the rain. Then Baron Vance's purse hit the platform boards with a heavy, contemptuous thud, coins spilling across the wet wood, glinting gold and silver in the torchlight. "Keep your beast, then," he spat, and turned on his heel, guards falling in behind him as he stalked away through the parting crowd, his cloak snapping in the wind like an insult. The auctioneer stood there with his hammer, utterly lost, looking between the fortune scattered at his feet and the woman who had just thrown away 200 silver as though it were nothing more than gravel. "She has chosen," the auctioneer said finally, because he did not know what else to say, and because the law of the border markets, unjust as it was, still held that a claimed slave could name her own purchaser if the purchaser accepted the bargain, and the seller allowed the sale to stand. It was an old law, meant for orderly transactions, never meant for a moment like this, but Urzoth's declaration had thrown the whole ritual into a shape no one in the crowd had ever seen. Luke Reed stood frozen, rain running down the back of his collar, 4 silver coins clutched so hard in his fist that the edges bit into his palm. "Well," the auctioneer said, clearing his throat, glancing nervously at the muttering crowd, 4 silver then, paid in full. She's yours, stablehand." Luke looked up at Urzoth's steeljaw, chained and soaked and utterly unbroken, looking down at him with eyes the color of forest moss, and he understood in that moment that his whole life had just changed, and he had no idea yet how much. He climbed the steps to the platform because no one else moved to help her down, and because it did not occur to him to wait for someone else to do the decent thing. The wooden boards were slick, the crowds murmuring a live thing at his back, and when he reached her he found himself closer to her than he had ever been to anyone in his life, close enough to see the fine lines of scars along her collarbone, the proud set of her jaw even now, even chained. "I have no key," he admitted, low, only for her. "I have 4 silver and a shoeless mare, and I do not know what I am doing." "You did not need to know," Urzoth said, and for the first time her voice softened just slightly, roughened not with anger but with something else. "You only needed to speak." The blacksmith, grumbling about the whole ugly business but unwilling to argue with the auctioneers ruling in front of half the town, broke the iron cuffs with 2 clean strikes of his hammer against a chisel. The manacles fell away, and Urzoth's steeljaw rubbed her raw wrists and rolled her shoulders like a woman shaking off a long sleep. And then she looked at Luke Reed as if deciding something important. "You will regret this," she told him, not as a threat, but as an honest warning the kind one gives a friend before a hard road. "Half this crossroads will call you a fool for taking home an orc. The other half will call you worse for freeing one." "I have been called a fool before," Luke said, and managed something that was almost a smile despite the rain and the danger and the 4 silver coins now spent to nothing. "Wouldn't be the first time it cost me something." She studied him a long moment, rain dripping from the tips of her ears, and then she said, "Then let us go before the little lord thinks better of his temper," and stepped down off the platform beside him, and the crowd parted for them the way crowds part for something they do not understand and are afraid to touch. The walk back to the stable where Luke worked and slept, on the edge of Miller's crossing near the river ford, took the better part of an hour through streets turning to mud beneath the storm. Urzoth walked with the careful, contained grace of a warrior assessing unfamiliar ground, watchful of every shadow, every doorway, every torch that flared in the wind, and Luke found himself watching her instead of the road more than once. "You should not stare, small man," she said without turning her head, when he had done it for the 3rd time. "Sorry," Luke said, and meant it, and did it again a moment later anyway, because he could not quite believe she was real, walking beside him in the rain like it was the most natural thing in the world. Miller's Crossing was not much of a town, in truth, a cluster of buildings grown up where 2 trade roads met at a river ford too deep to cross, except by the old stone bridge, with a scatter of farms and homesteads pressing close against the wilderness beyond. There was one proper tavern, the Broken Wheel, whose windows spilled yellow lantern light into the rain, and a trading post, and a smithy, and the stables where Luke had worked for 6 years since his father's death had left him with nothing but a name and a debt. The town existed because the crossroads demanded it exist, a waypoint for merchant caravans and drovers and the occasional patrol from the garrison 2 days south. And like most crossroads towns, it had learned to be suspicious of anything that did not pass through quickly. An orc walking its main street beside a stablehand, at midnight in a storm, was not going to pass through quietly. "They will be talking about this by morning," Luke said, mostly to himself, as they reached the stable and he pushed open the heavy door into the warm, hay-smelling dark within. Willow whinnied softly from her stall, and 2 other horses stirred at the sound of new voices. "Let them talk," Urzoth said, stepping inside and immediately going still at the sight of the horses, her whole body shifting from wariness to something gentler, something almost startled. "You keep good animals. They're not mine. I just look after them for the post." Luke lit a lantern hanging by the door, and in its glow he finally got a proper look at her, unshadowed by torchlight and rain. She was, he thought, the most striking person he had ever seen, and he did not let himself examine too closely why the thought made his chest feel tight. "There's a loft up above with a cot. It's not much, but it's dry, and nobody comes out here but me." "It is more than I had an hour ago," Urzoth said, and there was a rawness beneath the words that told him more than she likely meant to. He gave her the loft, and the single wool blanket he owned besides the one on his own cot below, and he did not ask her the questions crowding his throat. How had she come to be chained at a crossroads slave auction? What clan had she come from? Whether anyone was looking for her? Whether she had killed men to end up in a slaver's cage or simply been unlucky in a raid gone wrong? He judged correctly that those were not questions for the first night, not for a woman who had just been sold and unsold in the space of an hour, and who watched every shadow in the stable like it might hold a blade. "Thank you," Urzoth said, when he had settled in the straw below with only his coat for a blanket, giving her both wool ones. "For the roof, not for the coin. The coin was an insult, small as it was, and you should know that even 4 silver bought no ownership of me. I am here because I chose to be. Remember that stablehand. Name's Luke," he said. "Luke Reed, not stablehand, not small man either if you can manage it." A pause in the dark above him, and then, grudgingly, almost amused. "Luke Reed. Very well. I am Urzoth Steeljaw, and I do not give my name lightly, so mark that you have earned it." He lay awake a long while after that, listening to the rain on the roof and the horses shifting in their stalls, and thinking that he had gone into Miller's Crossing to buy horseshoes and somehow come home with the most dangerous, most beautiful thing he had ever seen sleeping in his hayloft, and that his life, quiet and small as it had been for 6 long years, was never going to be quiet again. Morning came gray and wet, the storm not broken but only pausing to gather its strength, and Luke woke to the sound of the stable door creaking, and his heart lurching with the fear that she had already gone. But she was only there, standing in the doorway looking out at the mud-churned street, her borrowed blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a cloak, watching the town wake around them with the same wary alertness she had shown the night before. "They are already staring," she said, without turning. He came to stand beside her and saw what she meant. A woman across the way, sweeping her porch, had stopped mid-stroke to gawk. A man loading a wagon by the trading post had paused, one crate in his arms, to whisper something to his companion. By the time Luke had fed the horses and brought Urzoth a heel of bread and some cheese from his own meager stores, half of Miller's Crossing seemed to know that the stable hand had brought an orc woman home from the auction block, and the mood on the street was not friendly curiosity. "You should not be seen with me," Urzoth said, taking the bread anyway, tearing it with sharp economical movements. "It will cost you standing you cannot afford to lose." "I don't have much standing to begin with," Luke said. Ask anyone. Poorest man at that auction last night, and everyone there knew it. That is not what I meant. I know what you meant. He looked at her and found her looking back, and something passed between them that neither of them had words for yet. I'm not sending you off to fend for yourself in a border town that just watched you get sold like cattle, Urzoth. That's not a kindness I'm capable of pretending to offer. She studied him for a long moment, and something in her stance eased just slightly, the coiled readiness of her shoulders loosening a fraction. You are either a very good man, she said, or a very foolish one. My father used to say those were usually the same thing, Luke said, and for the first time since the auction block, Urzoth Steeljaw laughed. A short, surprised bark of a sound, but real, and it did something to Luke's chest that he did not have a name for yet either. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them had planned, but both, in their separate ways, came to need. Urzoth would not simply sit idle in the loft. She had been raised to work, she told him, in a clan that valued strength and usefulness above all things, and idleness sat on her like an ill-fitting coat. So she began helping with the horses, and Luke discovered within the first week that she had a gift for it, nearly the equal of his own stillness around spooked animals, a patience with the young colts that surprised him given the ferocity she showed the townsfolk who eyed her with open hostility. You have a way with them, Luke told her, the third day, watching her calm a gelding that had been fighting its bridle for a week. My clan bred war mounts, she said, running a hand down the gelding's flank until it stilled beneath her touch. This is not so different. Fear is fear, whether it wears fur or skin. You only have to be the calmest thing in the room. Easier said than managed, Luke said, and she gave him a sideways look that was almost fond. For you perhaps, she said. You are not so calm as you think, small man. Your hands shake sometimes near me. Heat crawled up Luke's neck. That's not fear, he said, before he could think better of admitting it. Urzoth went very still, her hand pausing on the gelding's neck, and for a long moment the only sound in the stable was the horses breathing and the creak of the old wood settling around them. No, she said finally quietly, I do not think it is. Neither of them said anything more about it that day, but something had shifted, some unspoken acknowledgement settling between them like a held breath neither was ready to release. It was not only the horses and the slow, careful dance of two people learning each other's edges that filled those first weeks. The town's hostility did not fade simply because Luke had freed, really, whatever the auctioneer's ledger called it, an orc woman at a public sale. Miller's Crossing had a long memory of border wars, of raids on outlying farms a generation back, of orc warbands that had once made the crossroads a place of ash and grief before an uneasy peace had settled over the region. Old wounds did not close simply because one orc woman worked quietly in a stable and troubled no one. The trouble started small, a dead rat left on the stable's threshold, a whispered insult when Urzoth walked to the well for water, a merchant who refused to sell Luke feed for his horses until he swore the orc would not touch it with her hands. Luke bore each slight with a tight jaw and a controlled temper that cost him more than he let show, and Urzoth bore it all with the flat, contemptuous patience of a woman who had faced worse than village gossip, and did not intend to give small men the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. But contempt was not the only current running beneath the surface of Miller's Crossing, and Luke learned that the hard way on an evening 3 weeks after the auction, when Baron Vance's steward came to the stable with a folded parchment and a face that promised nothing good. The Baron wishes it known, the steward said, not bothering to dismount his horse, that the sale at auction was irregular and may be contested before the circuit magistrate when he next rides through. The Baron believes the orc's declaration was made under duress and does not represent a lawful transfer. She wasn't under duress from me, Luke said, standing his ground though his stomach had gone cold. She chose. The magistrate will decide what she chose, the steward said, and left the parchment in Luke's hand before riding off, and Luke stood there in the fading light reading words that made his hands go numb. a formal notice of contest, citing the sale as void, demanding Urzoth's steel or be returned to the auctioneer's custody pending review. Urzoth read it over his shoulder, her jaw tightening with each line. "He means to take me back," she said, "and finish what he started." "He means to try," Luke said, and found, beneath the fear, a hard and unfamiliar anger settling into his bones. "The magistrate doesn't ride through for another 2 months. That's 2 months he can't touch you by any law I know of. Vance does not strike me as a man who waits on the law when he has coin and guards enough to do otherwise," Urzoth said grimly, and she was right, though neither of them yet knew how right, nor how soon they would learn it. The attraction between them, once acknowledged even in that small, unspoken way in the stable, did not simmer quietly. It grew, week over week, in the small moments that filled their days, her hand brushing his as they mended a length of fence together, the way she had begun, without quite realizing it, to stand closer to him than she stood to anyone else, the way he found excuses to linger near the loft ladder in the evenings just to hear her voice as she settled for the night. It came to its first breaking point on a warm evening in early autumn, 6 weeks after the auction, when a summer storm rolled through the crossroads and Luke, checking the stable roof for leaks, slipped on the wet ladder and fell hard onto his back in the straw below. Urzoth was down from the loft before he had finished cursing, kneeling over him with a fierceness in her eyes that had nothing to do with anger. "Fool man," she said, hands running over his shoulders, his ribs, checking for breaks with the brisk efficiency of someone who had tended battlefield wounds before. "Climbing wet wood in a storm." "I'm fine," Luke said, though the wind was still knocked half out of him, and then because her face was very close to his and her hands were still on him, and something in his chest had been building toward this moment for 6 weeks, he added, "Urzoth, do not," she said, but her voice had gone rough and she had not moved away. "Do not what?" "Do not say something we cannot take back, small man, when I am still deciding whether I can afford to want you." The honesty of it startled him more than any denial would have. "You want me." "I have wanted you since you spoke 4 silver into a crowd that would have laughed a lesser man out of the square," she said, low, fierce, her hand still braced against his chest. "And every day since has made it worse, not better, and I do not know what to do with that because my clan does not love softly, Luke Reed. When we choose with claws out, and I do not know if you are prepared for what it means to be chosen by an orc who means it." "Try me," Luke said, and reached up to touch her face, the first time he had dared, his fingers finding the sharp line of her jaw, the surprising softness of skin beneath rough calluses, and Urzoth Steeljaw closed her eyes and leaned into the touch like something starved finally allowed to feed. "This is madness," she murmured. "Probably," Luke agreed. "The whole town already despises you for keeping me." "They can despise me for something worth despising then," he said, and drew her down, and the kiss that followed was nothing tentative, nothing careful. It was 6 weeks of restraint breaking at once, her hands fisting in his shirt, his arms wrapping around her with a desperate certainty he had never felt for anyone before, the storm hammering the roof above them and neither of them caring in the slightest. When they finally broke apart, breathless, straw-tangled, Urzoth pressed her forehead to his and let out a long, unsteady breath. "This changes things," she said. "I know. If Vance learns of it, if the town learns of it fully, not just suspects it, it will go worse for you than gossip and dead rats on the threshold." "I know that too," Luke said, and found he did not care, not with her weight still braced over him and her mouth still close enough to taste. "I decided a long time ago I was going to be a fool about this, Urzoth. Might as well be a fool all the way." She laughed against his throat, low and warm, and for a moment the storm outside and the danger circling closer every week seemed very far away indeed. But danger, once it starts circling, does not stay far away for long, and the next turn came faster and harder than either of them expected. It was a night nearly 2 months after the auction, with the circuit magistrate expected within the week and Baron Vance's contest notice still sitting unresolved. When the midnight raid came, Luke woke to the sound of the stable dogs barking in a pitch he had never heard from them before. Not the ordinary bark at a passing fox, but something frantic, terrified, cut short too quickly. He was on his feet with his heart slamming before his mind had caught up, and Urzoth was already down from the loft, a length of iron fence post gripped in one hand like a weapon, her eyes gone flat and hard with a soldier's readiness. "Men," she said quietly. "At least 4 coming from the roadside. Vance's guards, or men he paid who do not answer to any law at all." She was already moving toward the stable's side door, motioning him to follow, to stay low. He grew tired of waiting for the magistrate. Through a gap in the wall boards, torchlight flickered outside 4, maybe 5 men, moving with the careful quiet of people who did not want witnesses, converging on the stable from the tree line beyond the paddock. One of them carried rope. Another carried something that glinted like a manacle in the moonlight, and Luke's blood went cold with understanding. They had not come to kill him outright. They had come to take Urzoth back quietly before the magistrate could rule on anything, and Luke Reed was simply in the way of that plan. An inconvenience to be removed, however, was easiest. "There's a hay hook by the far stall," Luke breathed. "Pitchfork by the tack room." "Get them both," Urzoth said. "And Luke, stay behind me until I say otherwise. These are not drunk men from a tavern. They will not hesitate." He wanted to argue that he was not going to hide behind her while men came to drag her away in chains again. But there was no time, and some deep instinct told him this once. In this fight, her judgment on where he should stand was the only thing that might keep them both breathing until dawn. The first guard came through the side door expecting a sleeping stablehand and an unarmed captive, and got instead an iron fence post swung with the full force of Urzoth Steeljoe's fury, catching him across the jaw and dropping him like a felled tree before he had even drawn his blade. The second man shouted an alarm, and after that there was no more pretense of quiet. Luke came around the stall wall with the pitchfork just as a third man lunged at him with a short sword, and he only barely got the tines up in time to deflect the blow, the impact numbing his arms to the shoulder. He had never fought a man with intent to kill in his life. He had broken up tavern brawls, gentled panicked horses, mended fences after storms, but nothing in his 26 years had prepared him for the cold, clarifying terror of a blade aimed at his chest. "Luke." Urzoth's voice, sharp with warning, and he threw himself sideways just as a fourth man's club whistled past where his head had been. And then Urzoth was there, fence post cracking across the club wielder's ribs with a sound that made Luke's stomach turn, and the man went down gasping. The swordsman Luke had deflected recovered his balance and came again, faster this time, and Luke fell back a step, another, the stall wall at his back now, nowhere left to retreat. He raised the pitchfork with hands that would not quite stop shaking, and thought, with a strange calm clarity, that this might genuinely be how his life ended, in a stable he did not own, over a woman he had known for 2 months and loved with a suddenness that terrified him more than the blade did. Then Urzoth was at his back, truly at his back, close enough that he felt her shoulder blade against his, the two of them turning in a rough circle as 2 more men closed in from opposite sides, hunter and hunted trading places in the space of a breath. What had been 4 attackers against 2 defenders became, in that narrow space between stalls, a fight where neither Luke nor Urzoth could afford to think of anything but the next half-second, moving together with an instinct neither of them had practiced but both of them somehow knew, her strength anchoring his uncertain footing, his voice calling warnings her peripheral vision missed. "Behind you!" Luke shouted, and Urzoth spun, catching a descending club on the fence post with a shock that traveled up both their arms, and drove her elbow into the attacker's throat with brutal, economical force. "Down!" She barked back a heartbeat later, and Luke dropped to one knee as her fence post swept over his head and caught the swordsman across the temple, ending that fight as suddenly as it had begun. For a moment, in the wrecked and torchlit stable, with 2 men groaning on the ground and 2 more fled or fallen, there was only ragged breathing and the frightened stamping of the horses in their stalls. "You are hurt," Urzoth said, rounding on him, and only then did Luke notice the shallow cut along his forearm, bleeding freely but not deep, where the swordsman's first blow had caught him before he deflected it fully. "It's nothing," he said, though his voice shook. "You, bruised, nothing worse." She was already tearing a strip from her sleeve to bind his arm, her hands steady now though they had been shaking with adrenaline a moment before, and Luke understood, watching her work, that she had done this before tended wounds in the aftermath of violence, more times than he wanted to imagine. This was not Vance's doing alone. Common thugs do not carry manacles fitted for orc wrists unless someone paid specifically for that purpose. "He's not going to stop," Luke said, the reality of it settling cold and heavy in his chest. "Even if we survive tonight, he's not going to stop until the magistrate rules or you're back in his hands." "Then we do not wait for the magistrate," Urzoth said, tying off the bandage with a sharp, decisive motion. "We make this town choose, Luke Reed, before Vance decides murder is easier than law." They did not sleep the rest of that night. By dawn, word of the attack had already begun spreading through Miller's Crossing. One of the fled attackers had been recognized by the smith's apprentice as a man in Vance's household guard. And suddenly, the quiet contempt of the town curdled into something more complicated. Fear of the Baron's overreach mixing uneasily with the town's long habit of distrusting orcs, until nobody quite knew which way their sympathies were meant to fall. It was into that uncertain, dangerous silence that Luke Reed made his decision. "I'm going to the trading post," he told Urzoth, as the sun came up gray and reluctant over the crossroads. "I'm going to ask for a public hearing, right there in the square, before the whole town, before the magistrate even arrives. Let everyone hear exactly what happened last night, and exactly what happened at that auction. Let them decide with their own eyes whether Vance is a man who respects the law or a man who sends thugs in the night when the law doesn't suit him. They may not care," Urzoth warned. "Half this town already thinks little enough of me to let Vance do as he pleases." "Then we'll find out," Luke said, "but I'm done letting this happen in shadows and back rooms. If they're going to judge us, they can do it in the light, where Vance has to stand there and answer for what he sent into my stable last night." Urzoth looked at him for a long moment, something fierce and proud kindling in her moss-green eyes. "You have grown teeth since the auction block, small man." "Had a good teacher," Luke said, and the ghost of a smile passed between them even through the exhaustion and the fear. Word spread fast in a crossroads town, faster still when the word involved violence and a baron and an orc who had once thrown 200 silver back into a crowd's face. By midday, a crowd had gathered in the square before the trading post, not the whole town, but enough of it, merchants and farmers and the blacksmith and the tavern keeper from the Broken Wheel, all drawn by curiosity or outrage or simple hunger for spectacle. Baron Vance arrived with his guard, summoned by his own steward who had heard the gathering crowd and feared what might be said without his master present to shape the story. He arrived furious and made no effort to hide it, his fine cloak dark with the drizzle that had returned to hang low over the crossroads. "This is a farce," Vance announced, before Luke had even finished explaining the raid to the assembled townsfolk. A stablehand's fevered tale to cover for harboring a dangerous creature that ought to have been destroyed at the border rather than sold at all. 4 of your men came into my stable in the dead of night carrying manacles fitted for orc wrists," Luke said, his voice carrying farther and steadier than he expected, fear burned away now by something harder. "One of them is lying in the smith's barn with a broken jaw right now, and the smith's own apprentice will tell you he recognized the man's livery. You didn't come to contest a sale through the magistrate, my lord. You came to steal her back before the magistrate ever had the chance to rule, because you knew the sale would stand." A murmur moved through the crowd, uncertain, testing the shape of this new information. Preposterous, Vance said, but there was a thinness in his voice now that had not been there a moment before. Bring the man out, Luke said. The one with the broken jaw. Let him tell the crowd himself who sent him and why. Vance's eyes flickered just once toward his remaining guards, and in that flicker the whole crowd read something true, whatever words he might have chosen to say next. It was Urzoth who stepped forward then, into the square, into the full gray daylight before the gathered townsfolk who had watched her sold like cattle 2 months before. And the crowd went quiet at the sight of her, wary and watchful, waiting to see what a chained and freed orc woman would say to the Baron who had tried twice now to take her. I have killed men before, Urzoth said, her voice carrying easily across the square, flat and certain, in raids, in wars, in defense of my own clan, and I do not pretend otherwise to make myself more palatable to your fear of me. But I did not kill the men who came to my stable last night, though I could have, and though every one of them deserved worse than the bruises I gave. I let them live, and I let them run, because I wanted this town to see them, to hear from their own mouths who sent them, so that no one here could pretend afterward not to know what kind of man commands them. She turned, slow and deliberate, to face Vance directly. You bought nothing at that auction, little lord, but the right to be humiliated in front of witnesses. I chose the poorest man in that square over you and your 200 silver, and I choose him again now, and I will keep choosing him every single day you send men to try to change my mind, until either you stop or I stop breathing. Decide which of those you can live with in front of everyone here, because I am done deciding it quietly. The square was utterly silent. It was the tavern keeper of the Broken Wheel, a heavy-set woman named Sarah Hollies, who had buried a brother in the old border wars and had no particular love for orcs on principle, who broke the silence first, and what she said surprised everyone, including herself. My brother died fighting orcs 20 years back, Sarah said, loud enough for the whole square to hear, and I've spent every year since hating the sight of green skin on principle, and I'm not ashamed to say it. But I watched Baron Vance's steward ride out to that stable with a notice meant to strip a lawful sale, and I heard what happened last night from my own stable boy who saw the men running past my back fence with blood on their knuckles and manacles in their packs. Whatever I think about orcs in general, I know a coward hiding behind coin and title when I see one, and I've known Luke Reed since he was a boy mucking stalls for his father, and he's never told a lie in his life that I've caught him in. If he says those men came to steal her back in the dark, I believe him over any baron's word. More murmurs, and this time they did not sound uncertain. They sounded like a crowd finding its spine. The magistrate rules in 5 days, called out the blacksmith, wiping soot-stained hands on his apron. Let him rule then, fair and proper, on the sale and on last night's business both. But I'll say this in front of everyone here. Any man of Vance's who sets foot near that stable again before the magistrate arrives answers to more than the law. We may not all love orcs in this town, but we know a fair fight from a cowardly one, and last night wasn't fair. Vance looked around the square at faces that had, moment by moment, turned from uncertain curiosity to something colder and more united. And understanding dawned on him that he had lost this particular battle in the worst possible way. Not to a woman with a blade, but to public opinion, the one currency more valuable in a crossroads town than any purse of silver. This is not finished, Vance said, but it came out smaller than he meant it to, and he retreated with his guard through a crowd that no longer parted for him with any particular respect, and something in the set of Luke's shoulders eased for the first time in days. Urzoth found his hand in the crowd's shifting aftermath and held it openly in front of everyone, and if there were still stares, still whispers, they had a different weight to them now, less contempt, more the uncertain curiosity of people watching a story unfold that they had not expected and did not yet know how to feel about. You did that, Luke said quietly, looking at her. We did that, she corrected, and it is not finished, whatever they believe in this square today. Vance is not a man who loses gracefully. She was right, and the 5 days before the magistrate's arrival stretched taut with a different kind of tension than before, not open violence, not with the whole town's eyes turned toward the stable now, but a watchfulness, a bracing for whatever Vance might try next with his back against the wall. It was on the 4th night, with the magistrate due the following morning, that the true danger came, not from Vance's guards this time, but from the sky itself. The storm that had been threatening the crossroads for days finally broke in full fury after sunset, rain hammering down in sheets thick enough to blur torchlight into smears of orange, and within an hour word came running through the streets that the river ford was rising fast, faster than anyone had seen in a decade, threatening to swallow the low ground where half the town's homes and half its farms sat close against the water. "The stable," Luke said, already moving, already thinking of Willow and the other horses trapped in low-lying stalls that would flood within the hour if the water kept rising as fast as the panicked shouts suggested. "Urzoth, the horses." "Go," she said, already beside him, already moving with him rather than behind him. "I am not staying dry while you drown for horses that are not even yours." They ran through streets turning to rivers themselves, past townsfolk dragging furniture and children to higher ground, past the trading post where sandbags were being stacked in frantic, futile rows, and reached the stable to find water already lapping at the threshold, the horses screaming in their stalls with the particular terror animals feel when the ground itself seems to be betraying them. "Willow first," Luke shouted over the roar of rain and rising water, and Urzoth was already at the far stalls, working the latches with quick, sure hands, herding the panicked animals toward the door with a calm, commanding presence that cut through their fear better than any rope or whip could have. They worked side by side in the flooding dark, horse after horse freed and driven toward the higher ground of the crossroads square, the water climbing steadily from ankle-deep to knee-deep as they worked, until only Willow remained, cornered in her stall, too terrified by the rising water and the crack of thunder outside to move for either of them. "She trusts you," Urzoth said, water streaming down her face, voice steady despite the chaos. "Get her out. I will hold the door against the current so it does not sweep the stall wall in on you." Luke went to Willow's head, murmuring low and steady the way he had murmured to 100 frightened animals over 6 years of gentling horses that no one else could calm, and slowly, agonizingly slowly, the mare's ears came forward instead of pinned flat, her trembling easing under his hands. "Come on, girl," he breathed. "Come on, I've got you, I've always got you." The wall beside the stall groaned, timber straining against the pressure of rising water and current, and Urzoth's shout of warning came a half-second before the wood gave way entirely, a surge of black water crashing through the gap and slamming into Luke's legs, sweeping him off his feet in an instant. "Luke." Urzoth's voice, raw with a fear he had never heard in it before, and then her arms were around him, hauling him up out of the current with a strength that should not have been possible for anyone, human or orc, dragging him bodily toward the door as the stall wall collapsed further behind them, and Willow, freed by the breaking wood, bolted past them both into the flooded yard and away toward higher ground on her own. They broke into the open air together, soaked and gasping, water churning around their knees even in the yard, and Urzoth did not let go of him, did not loosen her grip even once they were clear of the worst of the current, her arms locked around him as though letting go might mean losing him to the flood after all. "I have you," she said, voice shaking now that the danger had passed, pressed against his soaked chest, her forehead against his shoulder. "I have you, Luke Reed, I have you." "I know," he said, arms coming up around her in turn, both of them standing in the flooded yard while rain hammered down around them and the crossroads square filled with panicked, shouting townsfolk and terrified animals, and for a moment, just that moment, none of it mattered except that they were both still breathing, still standing, still holding on to each other. "I could not lose you," Urzoth said, fierce and low, lifting her head to look at him. "Do you understand that? Not to Vance's men, not to a flood, not to anything. I have lost enough in my life, small man, and I will not lose this too." "You're not losing me," Luke said, and kissed her there in the flooded yard, rain running down both their faces, and it tasted like salt and rain and something that felt, for the first time in his life, entirely like home. The flood receded by dawn, leaving the low parts of Miller's Crossing thick with mud and wreckage, but the loss of life mercifully small. A few outbuildings collapsed, fences swept away, the ford itself scoured deeper than before, but no lives lost, thanks in no small part to the frantic work of a whole town hauling neighbors and livestock to higher ground through the worst hours of the night. Willow was found, unharmed but shaken, grazing on high ground near the trading post along with most of the other horses Luke and Urzoth had freed. The magistrate arrived that same morning into a town still digging out from the flood, and found, instead of the tidy legal dispute Baron Vance's notice had promised, a crossroads full of people with far more urgent things on their minds than an orc's contested sale, and a crowd of witnesses, still muddy and exhausted, more than willing to testify to exactly what kind of man had sent armed thugs into a stable in the dark of night, while the town itself faced flooding and ruin. Baron Vance, sensing which way the tide had turned in every sense of the word, did not even bother to press his contest before the magistrate. He rode out of Miller's Crossing before noon, his household guard trailing behind him, and did not return. The magistrate, an unhurried, weathered woman named Justice Prue Marrow, who had ridden circuit through border towns for 20 years, and had seen every shape human cruelty and orc suspicion could take, listened to the accounts of the auction, the raid, and the flood with the same careful patience, and rendered her ruling in the trading post that had become, by necessity, the town's makeshift courthouse. "The sale stands," Justice Marrow said, "as lawful and as declared. Urzoth Steeljaw named her purchaser under the old crossroads market law, and no evidence before me suggests coercion beyond the plain coercion of the auction itself, which is a separate ugliness this circuit has argued about for years and will keep arguing about, but is not before me today to resolve. As for the matter of armed men entering a private stable in the night, that is assault, plain and clear, and I have testimony enough from half this town to lay it at Baron Vance's door, whether he stands here to answer for it or not. A writ will follow him wherever he rides." It was not, perhaps, the sweeping justice either of them might have dreamed of in some finer telling of their story, but it was enough. It was law, plain and public, standing behind them instead of against them, and when Justice Marrow gathered her things and rode on to the next town on her circuit, she left behind a Miller's Crossing that had, in the space of one flood and one hearing, become a very different place than it had been the night of the auction. The weeks that followed the flood and the magistrate's ruling were not weeks of sudden universal acceptance. Luke was not so foolish as to expect that, and Urzoth had lived long enough among humans to know better than to hope for it either. There were still cold looks in the market, still farmers who crossed the street rather than pass close to her, still children hurried indoors by wary mothers when she walked past. But there was also Sarah Hollies, who began setting aside the good cuts of meat for Luke's table without being asked, and the blacksmith's apprentice, who had started asking Urzoth, shyly, about orc smithing traditions, and the trading post keeper who no longer required Luke to swear an oath about whose hands touched the feed he purchased. It was, Luke thought, watching Urzoth teach a stubborn colt to accept a bridle one crisp autumn morning 3 months after the auction, the town's slow way of deciding, one small unremarkable kindness at a time, that perhaps the story it had been telling itself about orcs for 2 generations was not the whole truth after all. The relationship between Luke and Urzoth deepened in that same season, through small daily proofs rather than grand declarations. The way she began sleeping in his cot instead of the loft above, not asked, but simply arrived at one night when the autumn cold set in, and neither of them wanted to argue with the plain sense of sharing warmth. The way he learned the old orc customs she taught him without prompting, curious and careful. The significance of a braided cord exchanged between intended mates. The meaning behind the particular way an orc woman marked a claim with a bite along the collarbone that healed into a pale scar meant to be seen and known by any who looked. "It is not romantic as your folk would tell it," Urzoth said one evening, tracing the place on her own shoulder where such a mark might someday sit, watching Luke's face carefully to see how he took the idea. "It is a declaration, a claim plain and permanent. My clan does not have soft courtships, Luke Reed. When we choose, the whole world is meant to know it, and any who would challenge that choice must answer for it." "I'm not afraid of being claimed," Luke said, and meant it entirely, "if it means you're not afraid to be seen choosing me. I threw 200 silver into the mud for you in front of half this crossroads," Urzoth said, arching a brow. "I do not think fear of being seen choosing you is my particular difficulty, small man." He laughed and pulled her closer, and the matter of the mark was settled between them not with ceremony but with the same quiet certainty that had carried them through flood and raid and public reckoning, both a decision made once and never seriously questioned again. Winter came hard to the crossroads that year, and with it came one final test neither of them had expected, though in hindsight Luke would think it was only fitting that their story, having begun in a storm, should be tested by one more before it found its true ending. A pack of raiders, human bandits who had learned that the road patrols thinned in the deep snow months, struck the trading post itself on a night thick with falling snow, 3 weeks before midwinter, seeking the season's stored coin and goods before the last caravans passed through. Luke woke to shouting and the crack of a torch thrown against dry wood, and he and Urzoth were among the first out into the frozen street. Urzoth armed this time with a proper blade gift, unspoken but understood, from the blacksmith who had grown to respect her in the months since the flood-end Luke with a stout length of ash wood he had shaped himself for exactly such a night. The fight in the snow was shorter and uglier than either the midnight raid or the flood had been. 6 raiders against a town roused and armed and no longer willing to be caught unprepared. And it was Urzoth who put herself, without hesitation, between a raider's descending axe and the trading post keeper's terrified young daughter, catching the blow on her blade with a shock that rang out across the square, while Luke came in low and hard against the raider's flank with the ash staff, driving him back long enough for 2 of the town's own men to close the distance and finish what Urzoth had started. When it was over, the trading post storeroom scorched but saved, the raiders fled or captured, the town gathered in the smoking, snow-dusted square to take stock of what had been lost and what had been kept, and it was the trading post keeper himself, a stern man named Osric who had never once in 3 months offered Urzoth so much as a civil word, who came forward and knelt, awkwardly, formally, before her in the snow. "You put yourself between my daughter and an axe tonight," Osric said, voice thick, "and I have spent months since the auction telling myself I did not owe you anything, that you were only tolerated here, not welcomed. I was wrong, and I say so in front of this whole square, and I will say it again to anyone who asks." Urzoth, visibly uncomfortable with the ceremony of it, helped him up rather than let him kneel further. "You owe me nothing," she said. "I would have done the same for any child, orc or human. That is not a debt. That is simply what a person does if they are worth calling a person at all." It was a small moment, in the scale of everything, no grand speeches, no sweeping change of heart across the whole crossroads in an instant. But it was, Luke understood, watching it happen, the true turning of the tide that the flood and the hearing had only begun. Not a single dramatic reversal, but 100 small ones, each person in that square deciding, in their own private way, what they had seen with their own eyes about the orc woman who had chosen the poorest man at auction and never once regretted it. It was midwinter's eve, with the snow lying deep and clean over the crossroads, and the town gathering in the square for the season's small, hard-won celebrations. that Urzoth Steeljaw made her claim formal and public at last, in front of the very square where she had once stood chained and sold. She did not ask him privately in the quiet of their shared cot, though she could have. She led him instead into the torchlit square on that clear cold night, before the gathered town, Sarah Hollies with her mulled cider, the blacksmith and his apprentice, Osric and his daughter, dozens of faces that had watched this whole strange story unfold across a single turning season. And she took his hand there in the open, in the light, exactly as she had once declared her choice at auction, and said the words loud enough for the whole square to hear. 3 months ago in this very square, I told a crowd of strangers that I chose the poorest man among them, and I meant it as more than a rejection of the little lord's coin, Urzoth said, her voice carrying clear and steady across the hushed square. I meant it because I looked at 100 faces that night and only one of them looked at me like I was a person worth speaking for, at real cost to himself, with nothing to gain and everything to lose. I have not changed my mind once in the turning of a season, through flood, through raid, through every cold look this town has given us both, and I do not intend to change it now. She turned to face Luke fully, and drew back the collar of her leathers to bare her shoulder to the cold night air and the watching crowd. I am Urzoth Steeljaw, and among my people, this is how we mark what we will not let go of. I ask you, Luke Reed, in front of every witness this crossroads can offer, whether you will let me mark you as mine, and be marked in turn, so that no auctioneer, no baron, no flood or raider or cold winter night will ever again have cause to wonder who I belong to, or who belongs to me. Luke's throat had gone tight, and he was aware distantly of the whole square holding its breath around them, of Sarah Hollies' hand pressed to her chest, of the blacksmith grinning outright, of 100 small sounds of a town that had, without quite realizing it, come to care how this particular story ended. I bought you for 4 silver and a mare's shoe money, Luke said, voice rough, and I would give every coin I'll ever earn for the rest of my life to keep you, Urzoth Steeljaw, so yes, mark me, claim me. Whatever your people call it, I don't care what words we use so long as the answer is you, always you. The sound the crowd made was not the ugly murmur of the auction night 3 months before. It was something warmer, something that might, in a kinder telling, be called a cheer, rising up into the cold, clear midwinter sky as Urzoth Steeljaw drew Luke Reed close in the torchlit square, in front of the whole town that had once watched her sold in chains, and marked him as hers at last, not in secret, not in shame, but in the open before witnesses, exactly as her people's oldest customs demanded and exactly as her own fierce, unbroken heart had chosen the moment he spoke 4 silver coins into a crowd that should have laughed him down. They stood together afterward at the edge of the square, her arm around his shoulders, his around her waist, watching the town's midwinter fires burn bright against the snow, and Luke thought that he had come to Miller's Crossing that rainy night 3 months ago with nothing but a shoeless mare and 4 silver coins to his name, poorer than any man at that auction, and had somehow, impossibly, walked away the richest man in the whole crossroads after all. No regrets, small man? Urzoth asked, low, teasing, her breath warm against his temple in the cold night air. Not one, Luke said, and pulled her closer still. Not a single one, and I don't expect to find any, not so long as you're the one doing the choosing. Then it is well, Urzoth Steeljaw said, that I intend to keep choosing you, Luke Reed, every single day for as long as we both have breath to choose with. And above them the midwinter stars wheeled bright and clear over a crossroads town that had learned, slowly and imperfectly and completely, to let 2 unlikely hearts find each other in the wreckage of an auction night and hold on.